update my carrier settings now. All right, welcome to another stream episode of From the Archives. So a bit of news updates and I guess other things. So the big news is this week I also put out a survey for my classes that I teach, and I think what we'll probably end up doing is switching over to YouTube Live, mostly because I already upload the results of the live stream to YouTube, and it seems sort of redundant to do it here on Twitch. So I think we'll probably migrate our live streaming over to YouTube. Now, I couldn't do it this week because I hadn't set up anything for YouTube Live, because they make you do 24 hours, or you have to wait 24 hours before you can go live. So I forgot about that for today's stream, but probably from the future, we're going to have to modify the script so that it says YouTube instead of Twitch, so that everything will just be migrated to the YouTube channel. We'll still upload stuff on my Anchor page, so then you can listen on Spotify and all that other stuff, but we'll probably modify that format somewhat. So we're migrating over to YouTube. I think SoundCloud, we're just going to have to abandon SoundCloud just because it's cost prohibitive. With Anchor, I don't have to pay anything to host my podcast or any of the episodes. With SoundCloud, you only get so many minutes for free. So I think I'll probably remove the backlog, unfortunately, of the 6 or 7 episodes I already put on SoundCloud, and then free up that space for the soundtracks for the video games that I am still developing. We've got to put out the distribution of the Ethnographer version 1.1, which will be released next week, because I have students that need to play it. So that'll be released next week. And we're also switching up the format per my wife's suggestion. So we're going to be reading some fiction books. So we've got, look at the glare on that bad boy, Jet Set, which is definitely a departure from the other books in the library. You can probably tell from the books behind me, a lot of the stuff that I talk about is going to be anthropological or archaeological, but what you can't see is behind the camera, there's an entire bookshelf with mostly fiction and English literature. So we're going to probably slowly incorporate them. I'd probably say we might try to do once a month where we do a archaeology, anthropology book, just to sort of vary things up a little bit, because they are in my library after all. And we might actually have my wife be a guest host on a future episode, so we'll see how that goes, what her schedule looks like, and maybe have future guest hosts talking about non-highly specific books, like the ones that I've been talking about lately, just to switch things up, and because I eventually have to review them anyway, so I might as well kind of sprinkle them in here and there. So the big takeaways are we're switching for sure from SoundCloud to Anchor. We're migrating to YouTube Live, which will be in the new introduction update. And I guess that means we can cut the script, so I don't need to say anything more about that. You can, actually, the script will be changed, so I probably can truncate a little bit there. So with that being said, we're going to start the quote-unquote recorded section of it, even though it's all recorded live. We're going to do the scripted part and then get into the actual episode, how it's formatted, as some of you who have watched previous episodes may already know. So with that being said, let's get rolling. Hello and welcome to From the Archives, a short podcast where I talk about a book from my library and whether you should or shouldn't read it. I'm Eric, a professor of anthropology at Cuyahoga Community College, and welcome to my library. The books in my library are sometimes old, sometimes rare, sometimes normal, but always interesting. This podcast is recorded live on YouTube at Anthropology Archives every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern. You might notice that's different because it used to be Twitch. We're moving to YouTube now. That's Anthropology Archives, all one word, lowercase. During live recordings, I promise to read all comments, questions, and reviews in a different voice or accent to make it sound like we have a bunch of people in the audience. Every episode, I ask myself the following questions. Who wrote it? What's it about? What are other people saying about it? Should you read it? And whether I should can it or keep it. Because ultimately, we want to know, should I keep it on the bookshelf or should we purge it from the library? With that being said, let's take a book from the shelf. And this book is right behind me, so within arm's reach. Not a very thick book. So when I originally picked this book out to talk about in last week's episode, I thought it would be a much longer read, even though it was thin, just because I knew it was about early migration into North America and archaeology of Paleo-Indians. It's called The Earliest Americans by William Scheele, or Scheele. I'm not sure how you properly pronounce it, Scheele, who was the director of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. Then it was called the Natural Science Museum of Cleveland. This was published by the World Publishing Company of Cleveland and New York in 1963. So a pretty old book about, some archaeology that obviously things have changed in the last 60 years. Yeah, I guess it's almost been 60 years since this book was published. 58 years, technically, to be precise. Hardback, not very thick. It was about, let's see here. It was only 59 pages with a lot of illustrations. I guess when I pulled it off the shelf, I thought it was going to be a much more dense read, and maybe it was specific about a site. But I soon quickly realized that this was an educational book printed for the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, something that they probably sold at their gift shop at the museum. So clearly designed for the general public and not designed for someone who's like hardcore archaeologist. But oddly enough, he gets really specific in some things and really vague in other things. But he provides some really, really nice illustrations. He apparently also illustrated everything. So kudos to him that he was able to, draw some of these early hunter-gatherer pictures. I mean, the stereotypical 1960s style stuff where they're wearing like these cloth. Oh, or this one. I mean, talk about an egregious perspective on what hunter-gatherers look like. This guy is like super hairy-chested. Looks like he's wearing a bear pelt as a loincloth, and then he's just holding his spear, ready to throw it. But, I mean, some of the other pictures that he draws in here are really well done. Like, this is a really well-drawn bison, Bison antiquus, I believe is the name of it. Is an extinct version of bison from the late Ice Age, the Pleistocene. So he goes into some specific details about like the Folsom site and the Clovis site. He explains how Clovis points and Folsom points are made. So some really nice lithic drawings like this, I guess you could say centerfold, in pages, well, not that you need to know the pages, but 20, 22 and 23, he shows how a Clovis and a Folsom are made, which I thought was really nice. I mean, they're really well done lithic illustrations. I'm not saying I could do better, but I have done live streams of lithic illustrations, and in my opinion, I am just as good as this guy, if not more detailed. But then again, that gets into the point of, lithic illustration isn't necessarily about being artsy. It's more about communicating information like flake scars and direction of flaking and all that kind of good stuff. But I was pleasantly surprised with this book in one regard, and that was in the questioning of how old the peopling of the Americas was. He talks a lot about sites that have radiocarbon dates from the 20s and or 20,000 to 30,000 year range, which for the time was pretty controversial. I mean, everything I learned in my undergrad was that people really didn't buy into these old radiocarbon dates, like at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, or at I think Lideman Cave is another one, where they found evidence that people had migrated into North America much, much earlier than Clovis or Folsom, which are considered some of the earliest cultures in the United States or North America. But generally speaking, in 2021, nobody's really contesting, the multiple migrations, multiple colonizations perspective where people came across the Bering Strait. So it gets a lot of the peopling of America's part right. The biggest problem, though, that I have is it's 1963. So it's very couched in this aspect of positivism, which is this metaphysics, or you could say ontology or philosophy, that science will solve all our problems and figure everything out. And so it's very much this like science thing is the answer. Anything that doesn't use science is dumb. It has that sort of feel to it, which, again, this is the 1960s when that kind of rhetoric was common. But I think the other big problem I had with this book was the subtle racism that I couldn't tell where uh, the author was trying to, like, I couldn't tell if he was trying to introduce some sort of racist ideology here, or if he was just stating, like, oh, here's some other perspectives on the peopling of the Americas. Like, and granted, I'm reading, this is from the text. I do not believe these ideologies, nor do I think that this is the kind of language that people should be using today when discussing Native North America and the peoplings of the America. But I just have to call out this particular segment that I think encapsulates the sort of subtle, not so subtle racism within this 1963 book. So here on page 54, this is towards the end, after he's talked extensively about how radiocarbon dating works. Like, when he talks about methodology and like the history of some of these sites, it's actually kind of informative. From what I use in my intro to archaeology textbooks, in fact, the one that I use in my class right now by Robert Kelly and David Hurst Thomas, I mean, they talk a lot about the same sites that he's talking about. Granted, they give credit to the black, I believe he's a sharecropper or a rancher who found the original Folsom or Clovis points. No discussion of him, of the guy who actually brought the attention of the Folsom or Clovis site to the archaeologist. No discussion of him whatsoever, which we now discuss in intro to archaeology textbooks. But in 1963, I don't think they were interested in saying, oh, a black man, found the artifacts and brought it to the attention of someone at a university who then excavated the site. So, giving credit where credit's due, that's, a product of its time. But this in particular is what I took issue with. So here's what William Scheele has to say about the peopling of North America. And I guess I don't really have to do an accent or a voice because he's from Cleveland. I'm from the Cleveland area, so his accent would probably be very similar to my voice. So can I get away with saying my accent or voice is just going to be Northeast Ohio Clevelander? Maybe I should really emphasize my A sounds, because the Cleveland, Rust Belt accents, like put the bag over the ear, almost Fargo-ish, but not quite. Such evidence is judged by men who are trained to recognize very small but important differences in skull structure. Comparing the rare old skulls of Paleo-Indians with those of more recent Indians, these scientists argue that the red-skinned people, again, this is his words, not mine, not how we would want to say it today, may not have been the descendants of the original Americans. Some anatomists favor the view that the early hunters resembled the dark-skinned primitives Australians. Still others favor a brown-skinned Melanesian, but whatever the belief, the most scholars agree that a people of well-mixed racial traits made the journey from Asia. Now, the problem I have with these sorts of quotes are, he says this a couple times where he's trying to imply that Paleo-Indians are not the ancestors of modern Native American groups, which is just mind-boggling that he could, in the same book, give all these details talking about radiocarbon dating and all of the clear evidence that we have of, crossing a land bridge, and then simultaneously drop some hints at the Solutrean alternative, which is this asinine hypothesis that someone came up with that, oh, maybe it was people from Europe came across the land bridge that connected Greenland, Iceland, and North America, and they walked across from Europe to get here. I mean, it's a bad hypothesis for many different reasons. The first of which is Solutrean points are roughly 40,000 years older than Clovis and Folsom points. So you have a sort of issue of, well, why is there a 40,000 year gap between Solutrean technology and Folsom and Clovis? Like, what, were they just hanging out in Greenland for 40,000 years or something? So, I mean, there's a lot of issues with the Solutrean hypothesis. So it's a mixed bag. For a book from 1963. It has some good components, but I would say it largely has a lot of bad components. Ironically, I think it still has a lot to hold up in the sense of, the age ranges, like 20 to 30,000 years ago. It's not something controversial today. I mean, like 6 or 7 months ago, back in 2020 over the summer, a cave in Mexico was excavated where they had dates pushing, some of the earliest Americans at like 30,000 years before the present. A lot old, like these are tens of thousands of years earlier than what some people think with Clovis and Folsom, which we now all understand is not the first peopling of the Americas. They're just one of the most widely pervasive in North America. And he talks about that in this book as well. It's just, it's got these racist kinds of 1960s style ways of talking about Native Americans, and then the Solutrean hypothesis. And I have something else bookmarked in here too. It looks like, talking about migration from Russia to North America. Like, there's a lot of interesting things in here, and honestly, I would say the highlight is the illustrations that he does. I mean, his illustrations are really cool, really nice 1960s style illustrations. Like this one on this page shows stratigraphy and how that works. Kind of gives some really good introductory stuff. If I was a kid in the 1960s, this probably would have been a really helpful resource that would get me into archaeology. But in 2021, I just don't necessarily see it holding up under the scrutiny of, there are better books that we could probably get away with, or not get away with. Get away with is not the right word. There are probably better books that we could talk about in 2021. Now, obviously, I'm supposed to ask my usual questions. Who wrote it? William Scheele. He has his little about page in the back. I didn't really find much else about him, so I'm guessing, from my understanding, especially in the 60s, back in this era where professional archaeology was so young that, if you were a white male and you had any sort of background, you could get the job, whereas today, you could have a master's degree, 15 references, and 5 years experience and still struggle to get a job. Different times. But here's our about the author that William Scheele gives about himself. William Scheele, director of the Natural Science Museum of Cleveland, was born in that city in 1920. He won scholarships in art and biology and was graduated from Western Reserve University in 1947. In 1939, he won the first annual bird art contest. So, he goes on and talks about how he's really into birds and nature and drawing, and then he started working for the museum and has been there ever since. He wrote a couple other books, The Mound Builders, The Cave Hunters, and Prehistoric Man and the Primates. I can only imagine those ones are also couched in 1960s style perspectives on archaeology. I'm really curious what the Mound Builders one looks like, because I'm sure that one has radically changed in the last 60 years. But what other people are saying about this book, it's a 1963 really brief educational gift shop book. So I could not find any reviews of it on Amazon. It's on Amazon, it's listed, but nobody's reviewed it. I can't find it on Goodreads. I did find, however, The Mound Builders, one person rated it 3 out of 5. Prehistoric Animals is also by him, Prehistoric Man and Primates, but this book does not appear on Goodreads. I could not find it by William Scheele. A Passion for Nature, The Art of William Scheele. So, it's not bad entirely. It's definitely a mixed bag, but for 1963, it could definitely be a lot worse. So I guess the roundabout, circling back to would I can this or keep it? I mean, the artwork, in my opinion, is worthy enough, and it's so thin that I kind of want to keep it, but at the same time, the content of the material doesn't really add any new value that I don't already have from other books that are more modern and up to date, that talk about Paleo Indians and the peoplings of the Americas. So at least from my bookshelf, it doesn't really serve a big function. But I think what I might do is, if someone were to want this book, I would donate to them. Otherwise, I'm really tempted to just sort of cut the artwork out and maybe make a collage of the artwork, because I mean, it is really nice artwork in here. And I would say the book is worth it for the artwork alone, just for the size of it. But for the content of it, it's not really anything to write home about. It's you could do a lot worse for understanding the early history or early prehistory of Native North America. If I can say my words, of Native North America. But yeah, I would say this is not anything that you need to run out and buy. So I guess if I have to give this my review, I'd probably give this a solid 2.5 or a 3 out of 5. I'm leaning more towards the 3 out of 5. Again, should I wholeheartedly remove it because of the 1960s ways of speaking about race? I mean, at that measure, then, On the Origin of Species should probably be canceled and removed too, because Darwin certainly wasn't exactly speaking like we would in 2021. But we can't deny that On the Origin of Species had a profound impact on science. Now, is this on the same level as On the Origin of Species? No, by any means, no. So I'm probably leaning more towards 2.5 out of 5. Yeah, so if someone wants this, reach out to me on my Telegram, Anthropology Archives. We've got a little Telegram chat on there. You reach out to me through the YouTube channel or through Twitch or through any of the different ways that you can reach out if you want to have this book, because the artwork in it is really neat. And if I get no takers, it's going in the book bin until we maybe find a taker, and then we'll probably phase it out from there, because the book bin so far consists of only 2 other books. Our book bin. So obviously, if I can it, there's the possibility of just straight up recycling, and so far I've only recycled 2 books. Otherwise, they're up for donation, and the only other 2 that are up for donation right now are Creekside is still waiting for someone to take, and Chinatown, Economic Adaptation and Ethnic Identity of the Chinese. So we're slowly working our way there. I will add The Earliest Americans to that sample of still interesting enough and worth looking at, if nothing else, but not so bad that it needs to be recycled. So the tier list, I'd probably say there's keep it, there is donate it to someone else, there is salvage some of the artwork and recycle it, and then there is the bottom tier, which is nothing else about it is salvageable, just recycle it. So last week's dictionary episode with the thesaurus, yeah, that bad boy was just recycled. Nothing to redeem about that. So those are the tiers that I have. I would put The Earliest Americans in, donate, and if nobody wants it, I'm keeping the artwork for this and probably putting it in a fun collage or something like that. And we'll see how many collages I can assemble over the course of this series. That's going to do it for this week's recording, or this week's episode, I should say. Next week, we're probably going to do a little bit different format. I'm either going to be doing, while I'd reach and grab it, Invitation to Archaeology by James Dietz, which is a really short read on archaeology from 1966. Or if I can get my co-host to record an episode in advance with me, we probably won't do it live, but the other book we're going to be reviewing is Jet Set, which is a strong divergence from our previous books that we talked about, but it is a young adult novel written in 2008. Definitely not in my wheelhouse, but I think it'll be interesting to talk about something that's very far afield from The Earliest Americans, 1963 book about the peopling of America, to a young adult novel about a teenage girl going to a Swiss boarding school. So that'll be an interesting shake-up to things, and we'll have more young adult novels like that probably sprinkled throughout, maybe once a month, maybe every other month. We'll see how often we get to them and how often I can get my co-host, my wife, to join me on those episodes. So stay tuned for that as it develops. Remember, we're going to be on YouTube Live now instead of Twitch from here on out, and until then, never stop reading.